Senate GOP Caucus Leader David Hann joins me now to talk about these new laws that take effect July 1st. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Senator, let's begin. Dozens of laws are ready to roll in. There are many from the tax bill and from the education bill. Just overall, which do you think are going to make the most impact on Minnesotans?
Well, I think clearly the tax changes will be the ones that will have the most significant impact on the economy and on citizens' pocketbooks, and I think will have the biggest impact across the state. I think it's interesting that we're now getting to the end as this is being filmed here, down toward the end of the fiscal year. So we've been operating under essentially the Republican budget that was passed 2 years ago. And we've seen, I think, a pretty good economy and some job growth and employment growth and surpluses in the budget. And we've been sort of operating under that. And now we will see, starting in July 1st, a change, as you mentioned, these new laws going into effect. And the tax laws are going to be significant. How that's going to affect growth in the economy, growth in job production, whether it'll have an effect on people staying here in Minnesota, investing in Minnesota, all those things we have yet to see. So I think that will have a significant effect. We'll see how that plays out into the future.
Senator Tom Bakk contends that the property tax relief is pretty significant and the elimination of the state sales tax paid by cities and counties. He thinks that these are far-reaching positive benefits. In your opinion, are there enough good parts of this bill to outweigh what you consider the not so good, the bad parts?
Well, in any budget, with all the bills and all the complexity, there's always good things, no matter who's in charge. We all know that. There's good and bad and everything. I would say on balance that the negatives outweigh the positive. Property taxes, for example. There's no question that property taxes are a local decision. We at the state level, there's very little that we have to do with property taxes. There are arguments that are made, and the DFL is making those arguments that we've done some things that are going to have the effect of causing local property taxes to go down. But historically, that has never happened. You know, you do things like adding to the LGA, for example. And the argument is that when you increase LGA, that gives the local governments an opportunity to lower their property taxes. But they never do. 20 years of history tells us that never happens. So even though the argument is being advanced that they've done things that will cause those property taxes at the local level to go down, I don't think there's much evidence to show that it will actually happen.
Some of the other consequences related to the tax bill include Amazon ending its relationship with affiliates in Minnesota who direct online users to go to their website. There's some pushback from farmers who are going to be paying sales tax on repairs to farm machinery. Do you anticipate other potential fallouts as a result of the new laws rolling in?
Well, I think there absolutely will be. This whole warehousing sales tax that has been talked about, even though it's going to have a delayed implementation, there are people who already today are beginning to make plans about how they're going to handle that. I think that's going to have a very, very dramatic impact if it stays in place. And there's been some talk about it already from Democrats even, about maybe repealing that portion of the law. So I think as businesses look at the effects of these laws and what they're going to have to do to comply compared to other places, other states, I think there's going to be decisions made that will have a negative effect on Minnesota's economy and the potential for investment and growth in Minnesota. We should be, I think, very concerned about that.
Let's talk a bit more now about the impacts to the students in Minnesota. We have early childhood scholarships. We have voluntary, fully funded all-day kindergarten. There are 2-year tuition freezes for the state's institutions. And something that's really fallen off the radar for many is the new way to assess students prior to graduation instead of doing a standardized test. You're passionate about education, and do you see any good, what's good? Where's the meat in this?
Well, I think, to me, the good part of the education bill that was passed is that there was some money put into the general education formula without getting into the weeds on the arcane issues of education policy. The general education formula is the amount of money that school boards get to manage and decide pretty much on their own how they're going to spend. And it's always a good thing, I think, when you're talking about funding education, to try to give local elected boards some leeway and some ability to decide how to spend money. So I think it was good that there was an effort to put funding into that general education formula. So I think that is a good thing. Some of the other things that you mentioned, maybe not so good. I'm not so sure that, for example, devoting the money that we did to the all-day kindergarten. We already have a significant investment in all-day kindergarten. A lot of it is done through the efforts of local districts. I think that it would have been better to have taken that funding and put it onto the general formula, for example, and giving districts the option to expand their all-day kindergarten if they wished. I'm not so sure that putting this out there and saying it only can be used for that purpose, there are some districts that are going to have a struggle making that use of those funds. They might have to look at building buildings or building classrooms to take advantage of that. I think it would have been better to use those monies more broadly. So I think that to the point about testing, we had in place 2 years ago some expectations about what was expected to graduate. There's evidence that we saw that showed that those expectations were actually working to reduce the achievement gap. I thought it was remarkable that the Democrat majority decided to give up on that after a relatively short time of trying to have those expectations, and then turn it over to a new regimen that says, well, we're going to have a standardized testing in place, but there would be no sort of cut score, no expectation of what you have to have as a score in order to pass. Those things to me are not evidence that there is a commitment to expectations, high expectations, a commitment that we are going to make sure our graduates really are prepared.
Now, we couldn't spend the entire program just talking about the education components, but given this is supposed to be a broad conversation, let's move on to some of the unresolved issues from the end of session. As minority leader, how active would you like to be in working on some of these issues that are likely to surface again next session? We've got transportation funding. We have the Safe and Supportive Schools Act. We have just a plethora of different bills that are likely to come up. How active do you hope to be, and how active do you expect to be?
We expect to be very active. Next year is going to be an election year for the House. We're not up for election in the Senate, but the House will be, and so I think there will be a slightly different dynamic as at least half the legislature prepares to go into election. There clearly will be a bonding bill. That's always been traditionally in the second half of the biennium. That does require votes from the minority, and so there's going to be a considerable amount of negotiation about what goes into that bonding bill, and typically there will be some expectation that perhaps we can translate our support for bonding for some support on the other side for things that we may want to do. So I think that that bonding issue will become a part of the dynamic of the next session. You mentioned the Safe Schools Act, the anti-bullying bill that was pushed at the very end. I think there might be an effort to bring that back, but that was a huge, costly mandate, $40 million to do something that all school districts today have, which is policies addressing bullying. I think there's real questions about why we need to do this at that level and the way it's being proposed, at the cost it's being proposed. We'll see if that comes up. That's a very controversial proposal. We'll see if that comes up in the next session.
Senator, I would like to ask you for the last question, the similar question I asked Senator Bakk. There have been several news articles on potential political fallout because of the way some legislators voted on issues or didn't vote on certain issues. Some of the examples that were cited included the tax bill and the same-sex marriage legislation. So as minority leader, given that it's your role to try to mitigate any political damage to members of your caucus, how challenging do you think it's going to be between now and the next election for you? Like you said, we're 3 years out in the Senate, but do you think you're going to be putting out a lot of fires or not?
Well, a lot of these issues about candidates and members, a lot of that is local. The way Minnesota politics works, candidates are endorsed by local political units, and they decide who their candidates are going to be. As a Senate caucus, we are working with these local party units, and we accept the people who are endorsed at the local level as their candidate. We try to work with them. If they ask us to, or if we're allowed to, we will give them our advice and counsel, but they are the ones who ultimately choose from among their citizens in their community who they want to represent them. So if they are unhappy with the votes that their local people have taken, they will make that known, and they will kind of sort through that on their own in their own way. Sometimes that can be challenging. I know there are votes that have happened in the past. I remember a few years back with the override of the transportation gas tax. That was problematic, and there are these things that occur. But a lot of that is sorted out at the local level. We try to, at the caucus level, to try to work with the local people. We try to give them our advice. We hope that they will not act rashly and maybe remove somebody, a member who's been a good member, just because they're unhappy with a particular vote. But sometimes we don't get the right to decide. Is
it too early to begin sending your message out to voters, preparing for the next Senate election?
Well, it's never too early. You know, what we do here is in the fishbowl, and everybody watches what we do, and a lot of what we do obviously has political overtones. We think that the direction that we've been taking as a state under DFL leadership in the House and the Senate and the governor's mansion, we don't agree with that direction. We think it needs to be modified. We'll have an election next year for the House and for the governor. We're going to be out talking about the things that we've seen in the last 2 years under a Republican budget and the things we think have been very positive as a result of that. And we're going to try to remind the voters of the positive things that have occurred under that budget. And we're going to also point out what we think are some of the negative things that are going to occur under the new DFL budget. And we'll try to remind the voters of that.
Senator David Hann, as always, a pleasure having you in the studio. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.